Welcome back, everyone. Next, we shall move on to the second panel under the title of Managing Volatile Capital Flow. Dr. Narongchai Akaraserani, the chairman of the MFC Asset Management Public Company Limited, as well as honorary advisor to Thailand's Fiscal Policy Research Institute, will have us the honor of moderating this second session. He is joined by our three distinguished panelists. Mr. Ravi Menon, the Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Dr. Subir Gokhan, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And Dr. Andrew Sheng, the President of Fung Global Institute. Please welcome our panelists and moderator with a big round of applause. May I now invite Dr. Narongchai to start the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the conference. Welcome to the second session. We had a very good first session with an extremely interesting conclusion. Spending more than an hour, and the conclusion was that women is a solution. I think Myanmar has come up with the same conclusion, so now they're treating the lady very well. Maybe Thailand is doing the same, the generals in Thailand may be doing the same. Our session is going to be about managing volatile capital flows. I'd like to introduce the subject for a few minutes. First, we are going to be talking about the foreign capital flows, not just domestic. Obviously, the title of the conference and all that tell you this, that we're going to be talking about the foreign capital flows. We all know that capital flows are very important, at least for two major reasons. And if the slide would move and make my point. First is about for every open economy, Thailand included, capital flows can support growth by financing and can also promote risk sharing if we manage this properly. We've had this experience, and since most of our audience are from Thailand, I think we can remember what happened here in the 1970s and 80s when we rely on capital flow for public sector investment. And then in the late 1980s and 90s, sorry, should have turned that off. In the late 80s and 90s, the capital flow supported the private sector investment. And from 2000 up to now, we have both inflows and outflows, but all very volatile, as you heard this morning. But at the same time, we continue to get ourselves involved with capital flow because of the risk-sharing objective that we think will be useful for us. At the same time, capital flows carry a lot of risk, imbalances. We experience that too in Thailand. Macro imbalances between public and private sector, sectoral imbalances between industrial and agriculture and services. We had lots and lots of money from capital, international capital in industry, but very little in agriculture and services because we basically closed those sectors to foreign investment. And we had also macro instability whenever domestic investment and domestic saving were not equal. Then sudden surges, that would be another risk, and sometimes stops. Again, we experienced that in 1990 to 1995, plus reversals. If you remember in 1996, 1997, suddenly the money stopped and suddenly the money flew out. We learned at that time that there was no love greater than the love for money. There was no fear greater than the fear of losing money. That was the basic truth that we have learned in our life. People may argue that they love their girlfriends more than money, but we don't believe that anymore. Now, options to manage capital flows. We're going to be talking about this. Macroeconomic and exchange rate policies. First set of options. We have a world of more than 100 currencies with very few major ones, all with independent monetary and fiscal sovereignty. It's a big headache. Macroprudential regulation of the financial system. Who to do it? By whom? By central banks? By finance ministries? By the IMF? If we have been successful, why so many financial crises? Mexico 1994, Asia 1997, Russia 1998, Argentina 2001, United States 2008, European Union now, etc., etc., etc. This is what we do in Thailand. We don't know. We do not know what to say. We say etc., etc. Next is capital flow measures. Which measures? Capital control, Tobin tax, administrative measures. These are the things that we would like to discuss. So our panel, all of them are with central banks or with central bank experience. Andrew in particular used to work for central banks. The others are working as a chief executive or very important executive of the central banks. The panel will discuss the following subjects. Please show the titles on the screen. Recent experiences with capital flows, lesson learned from Asia policy experiences, and principle to guide capital flow management. So basically, we will be discussing what happened, what's happening, what is going to happen next, why is it like that, and how to cope with all these capital flow situations. First, about the experiences, recent experiences with capital flows, both in and out. I'd like first to ask Subi, Dr. Kokan, to perhaps share his experience with us that we, as we all know, before 2008, there was so much money flowing into emerging economies. Of course, lots of that money belonged to us. We did not know what to do with them. We send it to the US, to Europe, and they send it back to us, or use some of our money. Then with the crisis, things stopped. But now, moving again, lots and lots of money moving with volatility. But we have observed that there has been very little restriction about this moving in and out. Would you like to share with us what you think about this?
Thank you, Naranchai. I think, first let me thank the organizers, ADB, Ministry of Finance of Thailand, and IMF for inviting me to share my thoughts on this issue. This is, of course, a larger set of issues being discussed with reference to global stability, and clearly exchange rates and external sector issues are a very important part of what might now be seen as global instability. So I think it's important that we focus in on this particular dimension. Before I get into responding to a specific question, I'd just like to point out a very significant contrast, at least in my experience. In May of 2011, that is just over a year ago, the IMF also co-organized a seminar on capital flows in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. And the theme was essentially the same, managing volatile capital flows. But the concern at that point was, how do we manage excessive inflows? How do we deal with money that's coming in and causing some kind of macroeconomic disruption? And 1 year later, the perspective has changed, I think, at least for many countries, including my own. The reverse has happened. There is far more concern, far more worry about capital outflows than about capital inflows. And so essentially, I think over the last 3 years, we've seen something of a symmetric situation where central banks in particular, but governments in general, have had to worry about how to deal with both large inflows and large outflows. And in dealing with those two different situations, I think there's a great deal of asymmetry. Now, despite this, as the question has stipulated, the response has not been, generally speaking, towards constraints, towards either imposing limits on inflows, or perhaps from the outflow perspective, well, that may be a little early in the game right now, about talking about capital controls in the traditional sense that we had 2 or 3 decades ago. And I think it's very significant that countries, by and large, central banks, policymakers, have really not started talking about a fundamental shift in the paradigm of capital account management. Now, the explanations that I have for this basically, I think, rely on what I would call paradigm dominance, which is that for a long time, and particularly the build-up to the crisis, we saw a period of very rapid global growth and relatively widely distributed global growth, accompanied by huge increases in global capital flows. So I think there is a clear positive association, and all of us recognize the benefits, as was pointed out in the slideshow that we began with, the benefits of global capital flows. Most countries, or many countries, have found ways to use them productively, to have them flow into channels which have expanded capacity, both of the financial sector and of the real economy. So this paradigm, to my mind, still dominates. We have become much more aware, in fact, acutely aware of the risks of having greater global integration of capital markets. But I don't think we've reached a point where these negative assessments have completely dominated or come to dominate the positive ones. Integration creates stakeholders. Integration creates a wider range of stakeholders in capital market, in global capital markets, and these stakeholders, I think, start to have a strong influence on how policymakers respond. It may be the right influence in some situations, it may be the wrong influence in others, but I think it's important for us to recognize that basically, as a result of this paradigm, liberalization is seen as an irreversible process, that as you move down a road, it is rather difficult to roll back, and in order to do that, the paradigm itself has to change. It's very difficult for individual countries to say, we're going to do something which others are not, because you run the risk of losing out on a sort of competitive footing with the rest of the world. Now, the role of capital flow measures or any restrictions on flows, I think in this broad framework has to be seen in terms of dealing with essentially very short-term pressures. They are, I think, difficult to visualize as a strategic response to an emerging or developing situation. And therefore, the judgment about how to use them and when to use them really depends on a judgment about how prolonged or temporary the pressure may be, in which case it may make sense to use them because it is perceived as basically a temporary measure to deal with the situation. But they have to also be judged in terms of the long-term signals that they may send about the nature of commitment to global integration. And I think that is a message that governments policymakers are very loath to send, particularly if it's going to be interpreted in a sort of negative fashion. So I think the balancing factor here is that you have to assess the benefits in the short term of using particular measures, which may be perceived as reversals, against the long-term risks or costs that they might impose. And so far, I think, by and large, the calculation is still very much in favor of long-term benefits.
Good. What to do, we can come back to that again later on. So basically, what we have heard is that most countries are not afraid of the flows, in or out. They think they can handle it. This is like what our government is telling the people about the flood. Don't worry about the flood. We can handle it. But then you see, even if we can handle it, there must be spillovers. Let me go to Ravi. When these countries are experiencing capital flow or the flood, there must be spillovers. You come from Singapore, you must have got a lot of the spillovers. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about the spillover effects, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Narunchai. Well, first I want to thank the government of Thailand and the ADB and the IMF for giving me this opportunity to be here at in this panel. I also want to particularly thank our Thai hosts for your warm hospitality and very efficient arrangements, which we've come to expect as a matter of course whenever something is held in Thailand. I think the question of spillovers is an important one. As we noted in the earlier session, we're all interconnected and our actions do have effects on others. But let's step back and ask ourselves also the question of the cause of capital flows, because that too is related to the interconnectedness phenomenon. These are really the spillovers from source countries to recipient countries. I think there are two sets of factors at play here. And they work together in ways that we do not fully understand. But nonetheless, it's useful to make that distinction. One are conjunctural factors that drive capital flow movements. And these are usually differences, perhaps, for instance, in monetary policy settings. Extremely low interest rates near the zero bound in the advanced economies must mean some response of capital to those interest rates. Sorry, I won't be using my slides, so I think we can keep the slides. I think this is a better format to answer a specific question. The differences in risk perceptions are also a very strong conjunctural factor that drives capital flows. So whenever there are instances of heightened risk perceptions in the market, capital flows respond to that. We saw during the period when the Eurozone crisis was first escalating, coinciding with a period when the debt ceiling debate was going on in the United States. That was the beginning of a great deal of capital flows to emerging economies. And they were making distinctions. Now, of course, in today's climate, now that the US situation has been addressed, although there's a fiscal cliff coming up next year, whenever there's a risk-on environment or perception, capital flows out from emerging market economies into the United States. So these are the conjunctural factors that drive short-term flows of capital. It's also useful to distinguish the types of capital flow that is happening here. The flows that respond most to conjunctural factors like these are principally banking flows. The cross-border assets and liabilities of international banks change dramatically in response to this because they are seeking principally for purposes of interest rate differences and exchange rate differences. And so it's largely reflected in changes in bank deposits. Now, I think there is another set of factors that has not been much appreciated. And those are the structural factors underpinning capital flows. And I think they are more important because what they are telling us is that some of these inflows into emerging market economies, if you abstract from the short-term volatilities, I think these inflows into emerging market economies are going to grow. Why? I think the fundamental structural factor driving this are the superior growth prospects in emerging market economies relative to the advanced economies. And capital is seeking higher risk-adjusted returns, and those are in many of the emerging economies. So one needs to cut out the noise that's driving short-term volatility and look at the underlying increase in capital inflows into the emerging economies, and that is a major spillover. If you look at asset portfolios in the advanced economies, there's a very strong home bias, and this is, I think, has been well observed in all countries. The funds, the key investment houses have a strong home bias because they understand home markets, they understand the immediate region very well. But I think that is changing. You're seeing institutional funds, professional funds, systematically diversifying away from advanced economy portfolios towards emerging market portfolios. This is going to have huge impact on emerging market economies because I'm not sure they're all prepared for the coming tide. Just a 5% shift in the equity portfolios of advanced economy portfolios will give rise to something like $2 trillion of capital flow into emerging economies. Now, this is 2 times the capital inflow that emerging market economies had in 2010. And this is something that's going to be ongoing. And these flows are going to be reflected more in the FDIs, but I think increasingly in portfolio flows into equities and bonds. And I think that means that emerging market economies can't wish this away, that in the interconnected world that we live in, these structural flows are going to keep coming in. And how do you deal with that? Well, how do you build systems to absorb these flows and use that to productive use? And in what kinds of instances do you need to put in place measures to slow this down or moderate some of its impact on the asset markets and the banking system? I think these are important questions of spillovers. A final point on spillovers is with respect to capital flow management measures. We must be mindful again that when one country imposes such a measure, it does have spillover effects on others. There are externalities. And if more and more countries do this, then the countries that do not do this will face the brunt of those externalities. It is not very different from restrictions on trade. Why does trade protectionism take a downward spiral very quickly? Because when one country slaps protectionist tariffs, it changes the rules of the game and the balance and prompts and puts very severe pressure on others to do likewise, and it builds up. This is not to suggest that we should not consider capital flow management measures at all. But what it does suggest is that there are negative externalities, and we're living in a globalized world, and we need to be mindful of these. And the sooner we have some frameworks and common understanding of how we manage these things in a coordinated fashion, the better it will be, and to reduce some of these externalities. Thank you.
Oh, now we know why there's a lot of spillovers. It's very difficult to manage money, much more difficult than managing water, obviously. Water just goes one way, to the lower level. Money is supposed to go to the higher yield, but with a lot of fear in between, so things get spill over. I'd like to move on to the, having seen, I think, Andrew, you have been observing all the situations and having seen what's been happening over the last few years. It's obvious that Asia has been quite resilient in handling this capital flow. What kind of lesson do you think we have learned from these experiences, please?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Khun Narongchai. It's such an honor to share a panel with you and with Subair and Ravi, this distinguished panel. And I particularly want to thank the Asian Development Bank, the IMF, and the government of Thailand for hosting this, because this is a wonderful opportunity for us to draw some very, very important lessons at a very, very, very difficult time. I was particularly struck by Christine Lagarde's very elegant way of expressing hopes and fears. Based on the fact that there are no women here. On this subject, there is no hope. All men here, So, but I think, Khun Narongchai, the point you've made is very, very well. Asia so far has escaped this, but there are very, very important lessons that we have drawn from the Asian crisis, and we should not be complacent, because I do not believe the lessons have not fully sunk in from the Asian crisis. Let me say this. The first one is that we have a major paradigm problem, which, when I studied the Asian crisis, being a first time in this area, working with Ravi and everybody here, using the words of Subair, there is a paradigm dominance. That paradigm dominance comes from the current way we analyze the problem. And in reflecting on this, I've come to realize what we're dealing is not a partial problem, but a systemic problem. And that the Asian crisis was part of a systemic problem that we did not quite understand where we went wrong, okay? And that we suffered from it. The idea was that the paradigm problem comes from the fact that all of us think that we take a big problem and we break it down into its parts, and that if a bank is stable, the financial system, and every bank is stable, the financial system was stable. If every country was stable, the system was stable. And in exactly the words that Christine Lagarde was using about interconnectivity, actually everyone looks stable, but the interactions between the whole system makes the system unstable, right? And that flow actually comes from the imbalance, the stock, the balance sheet issue. And that therefore, if we were to come from Mars and look at the problem of the Earth as a whole, we are very far from equilibrium. Because not only the flows have got larger and larger, the imbalances have got larger and larger. Could you just show that, McKinsey, my favorite McKinsey slide, if you don't mind, just to give you the illustration of that particular point.
Please.
Right? That, if you really look at how this crisis evolved, the big balance sheets are in Europe and in America, and the global balance sheet relative terms are relatively small. And that if you really look at the big flows between London, Europe, and New York, it was those highly interconnected flows that created that crisis that started with the subprime in the United States, then became the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And, we were not immune to this. The structural drivers that Ravi talked about is absolutely right. That if there was even a very, 2-3% adjustment in the portfolios of the big countries in Europe and America and in Japan, the rest of Asia, the rest of Latin America, Africa, emerging markets could get swamped, right? So the capital flows are a derivative of the balance sheet imbalances, okay? And that the point that you need to notice, could I have the second slide, the key points that I want to make, is that these capital flows are highly leveraged. And because they are highly leveraged, they are by definition volatile. And if your balance sheet happens to be out of whack, you're in deep trouble. And that's why the whole thing is systemic. It's all interconnected. These flows are very big. And so that if we were only to talk about one country trying to deal with this capital flow problem, you can't solve this problem. The problem is much bigger than that because it's a systemic one. And the Asian crisis has demonstrated this, and this current crisis demonstrated. There are some countries who have nothing to do with the crisis that happened to be next door, but because of the hidden connection, the contagion, you get affected. Just because you happen to be in Asia during the Asian crisis, you have pretty good balance sheet that what you thought was pretty good balance sheet, you got contagion. Same in Europe, right? So this is a problem that cannot be solved by one party. You have to look at the whole interconnectivity issue. And that's why today, when the IMF, the ADB, and Asians start thinking about this problem, we realize this is not a problem that will be solved by one party. It needs to be solved by all of us. Now this problem, again we come back to this, is very critical because if you look at one of the biggest player, and I'm not blaming the United States, but because they're the only one that has the data on this. If you look at the imbalance in the United States, can you show the second slide? Because they have the flow of funds data. If you take the imbalances from 1960 to currently, what is the big picture? This is exactly a electrical volatility chart, right? Up to between 1960 to about 1970, the imbalances were not more than 3% of GDP. At the present level, we are now talking about 10% of GDP, and even if there is correction.
So another explosion is coming, eh?
Well,
you look at that.
No, but this is only partial of the picture. This is one of the biggest players in the game.
Oh dear.
Let me say this, right? There's no intention for me to blame the United States for this, because it is a systemic issue. Now, if we were, both the IMF, I'm encouraging IMF to do this, if you were to do a similar study for the European, sectoral imbalances as a whole, then take the Asian one, you will find parallels in this. And so that there is interactivity between these imbalances that is causing these leverage flows. And we now realize that these leverage flows cannot be stopped because a lot of it is between the banking system and the shadow banking system, the credit nexus, that creates highly leveraged so-called hedges that if they're not careful become speculative, that you're not careful blows up, that you're not careful becomes a balance sheet liability of the government, then therefore creates huge fiscal imbalances which keeps on blowing bigger and bigger, right? And so, until we understand this from a systemic point of view, we don't have a national solution for this. We can try to mitigate this, but this is a systemic issue that we need to think much more broadly about. And that's what this is a study that we are doing in the FUN Global Institute, because we come to kind of realize that it's the network effects of the system that is beyond one component. That means it could be a country, it could be a sector, it could be an industry. All these are kind of interacting with each other in ways that we have not yet begun to understand. And therefore, what we need to do is to all of us work on this and approach this in a very systemic manner, right? That, we cannot deal with a systemic problem in terms of silos, right? You cannot deal with this from Ministry of Finance, central bank, regulator, real side, banking industry, shadow banking industry, etc. You have to take this as a whole, and then once you begin to understand this systemic issue, then you can address it, rather than say, well, I'll put up defense here, put up defense there. There's no simple magic solution to a solution of a systemic issue.
So this Asia resilience looks like a short-term measure. There's going to be a lot of explosion along the way. But so far so good.
So far so good because the very fact that we've been successful attracts the capital flows. And if the capital flows comes in, actually, if you don't manage it right, you can when the capital flows goes out, you're facing a completely different set of problems.
Then I move on to this, the capital flows toolkit. What do we have to manage capital flow? Perhaps I can ask you to comment on this. What the so-called capital flows measures? What are the options that we have? What are the things which are effective and so on?
Well, I think it's a little difficult to sort of categorize the response of individual countries into effective or ineffective slots. We need to have a framework, and what I'm trying to do is to sort of think of a way to categorize capital flows, and based on that to look at possible responses. So this is just preliminary thinking on my part, and I hope that it will lead to something concrete as we go along. But I think we now have the experience of, as I said at the beginning, of some symmetry, because till about a year ago, we were thinking of capital flow measures as containing inflows or restricting inflows. Now we have to think of capital flow measures, I think, from both sides of the spectrum, which is measures that will help to mitigate the effects of rapid outflows as well. And I think when we bring that symmetry in, although there is a fundamental asymmetry in terms of capacity, because theoretically countries have infinite capacity to print their own currency, so they can intervene to whatever extent they need to, but they don't have an infinite capacity to print other countries' currencies. So when there are outflows, you're restricted to the amount of foreign exchange reserves or foreign assets that you have. So that asymmetry part, I think we have some lessons, some common lessons emerging from both episodes, one of inflows, large inflows, and now more recently from some countries of outflows. And I think the simple way to look at this is to divide up the forces that drive capital flows into two categories. This is commonly used terminology, so I don't think it comes as any surprise. What is being driven by fundamentals, what is being driven by liquidity. And if we're able to identify, which is of course the challenge, because we do have an analytical debate on how do you measure the fundamental value of currencies, and this can yield somewhat different results if you use different methodologies, but I'll stay away from that debate. But if you're able to identify broadly that there are forces driving the currency that are basically related or driven by global liquidity, I think certain measures that apply to containing liquidity both ways, or maybe some sort of a zone or a range of liquidity which the economy can live with. So it may mean some sort of restrictions on inflows and some facilitation, some provision of liquidity when there are rapid outflows to help contain extreme volatility. But if the movement is because of fundamentals, then that requires a somewhat different approach, which is to address what everybody recognizes as the broader macroeconomic fundamentals of the economy, which is the current account deficit, the fiscal deficit, the rate of inflation, and so on. So if movements are being driven by fundamentals, then I think that requires a policy response which addresses fundamentals. If movements are being driven by liquidity, then that allows the use of somewhat more bounded or focused interventions which address liquidity problems, which presumably are basically temporary in nature. Now, how do we do this? I think there are three basic ways of doing it, and I'm speaking from recent Indian experience. One is, of course, direct intervention. That is because there is liquidity shortage, or foreign exchange liquidity shortage. You have reserves. You use some of those to supplement liquidity without, in our case, certainly targeting specific rates. The other is more, let's say, sort of tentative. The merits perhaps need more solid analysis. But given that there is enormous one-way pressure on the currency, to look for ways in which this pressure can be abated, and that is using some sort of administrative or regulatory measures that actually restrict access or participation by some participants, which are perceived to be channels of speculative pressure. So we've done some of those as well, putting limits on positions taken by various stakeholders and so on. So this, of course, is something of a retraction from market development, but given the nature of the market, there is an argument to be made for putting these restrictions. I think in different contexts we do see attempts by governments to restrict operations in certain markets. So that's the same logic that applies here. And the third is to find new ways of bringing in capital. So if the traditional flows are not, the channels are not working, then are there ways or new channels that can be opened up to do this? Of course, this comes with its own set of risks, because if you're opening up more risky channels, those have some long-term consequences as well. But all of these measures help to address what may essentially be a short-lived temporary or short-lived liquidity problem. But when we look at fundamentals, I think they stare us in the face. The current account deficit, we know what it is. The fiscal deficit, we know what it is. The rate of inflation, we know what it is. And essentially, I think when we're talking about a larger set of pressures on the currency, the combination of these liquidity enhancement measures and the policies that respond to fundamental issues, I think they have to work in concert in order to address the problem systemically.
I think that's very good. Easy to understand, if you look at it that way. One is fundamental, another is liquidity. And then the measures would be developed in order to take care of either fundamental or liquidity or both depending upon the time. Perhaps I can move on to Ravi to continue with this, things that we can do going forward into the future, including international activities, as Andrew already mentioned, things that we need to do in order to cope with the issues of the volatility of capital flows. Yes?
Yes, I think in terms of the approaches to this challenge, there will be two dimensions. One is a global and systemic response that's required, and two is what can countries do domestically. And both are important. I think Andrew, correctly pointed out that the nature of the beast itself is one of interconnectedness and systemic. And therefore the response needs to have that element in as well. But of course we don't live in a perfect world. It will take time, and it's not just a question of analytics, it's also a question of political will, whether such a systemic response in its full form will emerge. I think we are taking baby steps towards that, some improvement, but not quite there, which means there is, you cannot escape from having domestic responses as well, knowing that you live in an imperfect world and you can't change it, and what do you do about it? I think on the first, the systemic, we need a much richer understanding of the flows and relationships across institutions. And I think as mentioned in the first panel as well as by Andrew earlier on, it's mainly through global banks. The operations of global banks are at the heart of this. The chart that we saw earlier where Andrew showed the interconnections in capital flows across countries and geographies, we need to do that across global banks. In Singapore, we've done it very rudimentary fashion for the 150 banks in Singapore, and it's a fascinating story. It is really not a story about exposures. It is a story about network effects. Most analyst reports, including government reports, talk about, when they think about, say, Eurozone contagion on them, look at direct exposures and kind of say that, no, the direct exposures are small, we're not likely to be affected. But how many of us had large exposures to Lehman or to AIG? I think it's the way networks behave. And even financial institutions don't have a full understanding of this, because what they do is to cut direct exposures, but they do not know what their counterparties are exposed to, and the counterparties are exposed to. And that applies to all our institutions. And I think therein lies a need to get a much richer understanding of these interconnections and flows before we can even talk about, so then what are we going to do about it? Where are the vulnerable interconnections? So I think that is still very much work in progress, and some ways some ways more to go. Now, what do we do in the meantime? We still have to deal with the situation, and as I said, the capital flows are a fact of life. They are going to be with us, and so how do we deal with them? I think, Narincha, you quite very succinctly set out the three major approaches, and I think that's a good way to think about this. Macroeconomic responses, macroprudential responses, and capital flow management measures. The macroeconomic responses are the traditional responses, what the textbooks would tell you. When you're faced with large capital inflows, allow the exchange rate to appreciate. I think there is some truth to that. If you don't allow the exchange rate to appreciate, you're building up tremendous pressures, and it is a safety valve of sorts. But I think the second order and more nuanced question is, how much can you afford to let the exchange rate appreciate? In many emerging economies, the exchange rate is the most important price, a key determinant of exports, a key determinant of economic growth. In some of the smaller economies, it is also an anchor of stability and confidence in the economy. And we need to be mindful that too excessive a rate of appreciation of the exchange rate or too excessive a rate of depreciation of the exchange rate to accommodate the reverse outflows can be very harmful to the real economy. So there are real limits, practical limits to how much the exchange rate can adjust. But as a first proposition, I would argue that there is room for adjustment on the exchange rate. Asian countries have generally seen some of that. If you take since 2010, nominal effective exchange rates across Asia, about 4 to 8% appreciation. I think this is a reality and a response to the capital inflows, and also reflecting underlying superior growth prospects, which I mentioned earlier on, higher productivity growth. But given the volume of the flows that we're facing, I can't say that the exchange rate is going to be the major factor to absorb these flows. It cannot bear the bulk of that adjustment burden. The other traditional monetary policies are to tighten monetary and fiscal policies to sterilize the inflows and not let it infect the rest of the economy. I think that toolkit remains valid, and we should continue to emphasize that toolkit as the primary response. My argument is that in many instances that may not be sufficient, although I think it's a necessary part of the response. Then we move on to macroprudential as part of the approach.
Right.
Macroprudential responses. I think this allows in some way an opportunity to escape the rigors of the open economy trilemma, that you cannot control interest rates and exchange rates at the same time when you have free capital mobility. With macroprudential measures, you can actually allow the capital to come in, but address in a targeted fashion the areas in which they are creating problems, be it the financial system, in which case is banking, in which case you can have a range of microprudential measures to make sure that credit growth does not get out of hand with large capital inflows. If it's the asset markets, the housing markets, again, there is a range of options that you can take. I think many Asian countries have been experimenting with a variety of macroprudential tools to address the issue of capital inflows leading to asset market bubbles. Loan-to-value ratios, debt-to-service ratios, debt-to-income ratios, these are some of these tools that they've employed. They've also employed fiscal measures, stamp duties, transactions taxes, capital gains taxes. In other words, using price-based mechanisms to moderate the impact of these flows.
Right.
And I think generally they have been seen as successful. Although I should quickly add that we do not fully understand the transmission mechanisms, we do not fully understand the collateral effects of these measures, we do not fully understand the relative effectiveness of various measures. But this is at the cutting edge of central banking and regulation. And again, we need to experiment, watch the experiment, evaluate, adjust, and move on. And so they are not the complete answer, but I think it gives us added flexibility, macroprudential. Then we come to capital flow management measures, when all else fails. Now, of course, how you implement some of these measures is important. There is, I think, a shift in the paradigm. So the dominance has weakened, though I think I would agree here, and Andrew, the dominance, it is still a dominant paradigm with respect to this question, that under certain circumstances, there is a basis for implementing some of these measures. I think the debate today is, what is the sequencing? Do you exhaust your macroeconomic responses and your macroprudential responses before implementing capital flow management measures? I think that's a necessary debate that we ought to have. I would just venture that while the importance should be placed on the first two, you cannot ignore short periods of time when you are completely overwhelmed by these flows, where actually your macroeconomic and even macroprudential adjustments are not going to address the immediate problem at hand. And that is where some countries may need to resort to measures that can manage the capital flows directly at the gate before it comes in and you learn and you deal with it. And here I think the country context matters tremendously. The capacities of different countries to deal with this is a significant factor. When you have deep financial markets like Singapore or Hong Kong, it's an easier proposition. But when your financial markets are overwhelmed, I have quite some sympathy for countries to resort to short-term measures of this sort to manage the capital flows at the gate. They do not come without risk. The effects on investor confidence is something to be keenly aware of. The externalities that I spoke about earlier on is also another consideration. And at the end of the day, they must help to build confidence. And this is where I think the question of an approach, an integrated approach that we can agree on, is very important. The IMF has come up with a framework of sorts on these issues. We may not agree on every last detail of that framework, but I think a framework of that sort is quite necessary. Some emerging economies are quite suspicious whether this is going to be too prescriptive and a straitjacket. I would think not. I think having an internationally endorsed broad framework legitimizes the use of these measures. It will give markets confidence that the measures that are being undertaken by countries in their own circumstances subscribe to a larger framework that is robust, that is well articulated and well understood. Because responding to the flows with measures is one thing, but responding to them with these measures in a way that fosters confidence and credibility, I think that's key. You can impose measures if you have the credibility of your markets. And then if you need to unwind, you're in a better position. So I think there is merit in pursuing this approach towards an integrated framework for the management of capital flows, and not forgetting the larger issue of how to look at this in a systemic way to address the problems at root, the factors driving these flows and the interconnections. Thank you.
Yes, I thank Andrew to make comment on this one. Ravi is talking about what a country can do and sequencing of macro measures, macro-prudentials, and some of the capital flow measures, and also suggesting the framework introduced by IMF, so that whatever we do would be believed by, creating so-called confidence among the international community. Perhaps, Andrew, you'd like to comment on this, the international actions, and then go on to talking about liberalization. Every one of us continuing to do this liberalization. There must be some sequencing about liberalization in order to deal with capital flows. Would you like to, please?
I think I would really like to say that what Ravi has said is music to my ears. It is a systemic issue. It is a network issue. And we have to have the humility to accept that we are moving into a paradigm shift, not just on the real side, not just on the finance side, but on the intellectual side, how we look at this problem. So we have to have that humility, because the theoretical framework of understanding systemic and network shifts is not quite there yet. Okay? But there is a question of scale, and I think once we see this as a systemic issue, you have to look at its scale, and this is why I say, in all humility, the present way, global way of dealing with this problem hasn't addressed the core problems of scale. What do I mean by this? We start recognizing that this is a finance problem. Capital flows are basically finance, and is highly leveraged. So, okay, how big is finance globally? In 1980, 100% of GDP. Today, latest IMF Global Financial Stability Report, 4 times GDP, of which Europe 5 times GDP. If you include the derivatives area, depending whether you agree it should be notional or non-notional, gross notional 16 times GDP. If you net it off, almost zero. But we all know from this crisis, it's not net that kills you, it's gross that kills you.
That's right.
If country A, bank A doesn't pay me, I cannot pay the other bank. And if I'm dead, the central bank has to step in. What does that tell you? It tells you that finance is ultimately a quasi-fiscal responsibility.
That's right. Correct.
Now that is the balance sheet imbalance that we are now faced with. What is it? Advanced countries have reached 100% of GDP fiscal overhang, okay? Excluding the financial quasi-fiscal responsibility. Okay, asset bubble deflation is also a quasi-fiscal responsibility. Give you an illustration. How big is an asset bubble? Only data I have is from the United States, flow of funds data. It's roughly 280% of GDP. 15% decline in US asset prices, property prices, at 3 times GDP is 45% decline in GDP. 45% decline in stock in 1 year. How big is capital, bank capital, relative to this? Maximum 10% of GDP. You add in the balance sheet deflation of stock bubbles. The stock market dropped in 2008. It was another 45% of GDP. So in 1 year, looking at US flow of funds data, you had a 90% drop in the balance sheet effect, of which bank balance sheet and capital was clearly inadequate to deal with this. Now we're still pretending, I'm sorry to use the word, this very, very powerful word, sensitive word, that this dynamic provisioning will deal with this. The Spanish example is a very good one. If you move the 1%, 2%, 3% buffer of capital, and the banking system is 100% of GDP. I'm just using a number, not even for Spain. Okay? But the stock market, sorry, the property market and the stock market, when the real interest rate goes to 6-7%, how much do you think the asset bubble will drop? 30-40% of GDP. You think 1-2% of additional provisioning and capital can deal with a 30% drop in the deflation of high real interest rates? Forget it.
Well, that happened in Thailand 97.
Which is exactly what happened in Thailand, but we didn't have the data to deal with this. So, you know, if you were to be an analyst and you look at country A, and for perfect reasons, just before the crisis, you said, exactly like Indonesia's case, everything looked good. Then because of the contagion, they say, oh, you have this vulnerability. And because you have a stock market drop and a real property drop as real interest rates begin to rise, you're finished. But that perception itself drives the reality. And people can speculate. And so, you know, the capital flows, which are highly leveraged, that changes a perception into reality which we have not fully understood. And that's what I feel it's very important that we need a paradigm shift. That you cannot blame this crisis on country A or country B. It's, you know, or country C, or even a group of countries. It's the interaction between them. But it is important to understand scale in network systems. That the large scale systems with large stock imbalances create very large flow imbalances. Yeah. Now we come back to the fundamental problem, which is the heart of my recommendation to the PowerPoint. Yes. Some of you may not have seen, which is that we have allowed leveraged financial flows between the shadow banking system and the banking system that creates very large transactions with zero contribution to the tax base. But when the system collapses, it becomes a quasi-fiscal deficit. That's right. For which no government in the world today is large enough to tackle. So how can we have a situation whereby effectively, and this is not a complaint against the financial system, it is that how do we address the incentives and the taxability of a systemic development in the financial system so that we can restore fiscal balance for not just the advanced countries, but for the globe as a whole. Because if the fiscal imbalance plus high real interest rates equals fiscal, sorry to say, insolvency, then no amount of financial capital can solve this particular problem.
That's right.
Right? I mean, this is by definition. Yes. Because the anchor of bank capital is national solvency. And no nation can sustain probably 7 to 10% real GDP, especially if inflation now drops, you know, to negative levels. So once you understand this from a balance sheet, stock flow, systemic issue of the interaction, the solutions are very different. And that's why I want to use this phrase. The word liberalization is a very old paradigm way of thinking about this. It's not about regulation or deregulation. It's about recalibration. We need to recalibrate the whole system in a way that is systemically sustainable. At the moment, it's definitely in my book, and I'm speaking only personally for myself, the whole present paradigm is fiscally unsustainable. We want growth. Of course we should have growth. We must grow our way out of it. But can you create more growth through even higher fiscal deficits? And at the same time create leverage that all the data shows is not going to supporting the real sector, but to support more speculative OTC transactions that nobody is monitoring, and everybody says net has no implications at all. It can't be right. It doesn't add up. Systemically, it doesn't add up. right? And that's the heart of the problem. So I don't want to use the word liberalization. I want to use the word recalibration. We need to recalibrate the whole system in a way that is not just sustainable for one country, for one company, for one sector, but for the world as a whole. Because if it is not sustainable, the system will blow itself up. And the data that we've shown, the very simple charts that we've shown, shows that the present system as designed may be in a volatility that grows bigger and bigger, and that until we change the incentives towards a self-stabilizing equilibrium direction, we may end up exactly with the Soros argument that we have gone into positive feedback that's moving us further and further away from equilibrium. And that's the danger that we really face.
Wow, that's very powerful statement, particularly coming from a certified accountant. He explained it so well, economists would not be able to do that kind of explanation. Well, and you're very right when you talked about this quasi-fiscal responsibility. When we were having this huge capital flow in the early 1990s in Thailand, that was mainly into the private sector debt. And we were saying that, this is private sector borrowing, it would be okay. They would take care of themselves, and the lenders would know who to lend to, they would take care of themselves. Then 97 came, and then we realized that what happened was that the gains were privatized, but losses were all socialized. And up to today, we still have that huge losses in our book, more than 1 trillion baht. So that was the situation. This interesting phrase about not liberalization, but recalibration. Perhaps I should ask Sabi to talk about liberalization or recalibration. It sounds like engineer, doing it, recalibrating or something. Please,
Yeah,
Sabi.
I think what has certainly been highlighted by Ravi and perhaps to an extent by Andrew is that we have seen the two, shall I say, extreme ends of a broader framework. We've seen a sort of fixed exchange rate regime which has certain benefits and certain costs both to the country that is implementing it and to perhaps a larger global system. We've seen instances of floating rates, and again there are costs and benefits associated with it. But I think as a result of these experiences, recent experiences, we are trying to move towards a more comprehensive framework which establishes the middle ground as well, and not just in abstraction, but in concrete terms of the kinds of situations that countries are likely to face, and the capacities that they need to deal with them, and what sort of instruments are appropriate to respond to specific shocks, given the country's structure and institutional mechanism. So fleshing out that framework, I think, is what some early work by the IMF has attempted to do, and I think that's really something that we need to collectively focus on. It's not yet to a point where it comes out with very clear-cut policy recommendations, and as Ravi said, there is a danger in that also, because then it appears to be sort of an official response framework, which is not, it need not be. But I think the underlying principles are quite straightforward, and Andrew's point about ultimately everything being a fiscal commitment is very important, because when we look at the freedom or the space that private capital flows are to be given, identifying the kinds of risks that they bring into the system is very important. As you yourself said, there have been situations where the risk was not adequately identified. And once you identify a risk, then you have to also be sure that you have the capacity to either buffer it or mitigate it or deal with the consequences. And that's where the fiscal capacity becomes very significant. So I would say that that transparency is a critical principle. Do we all know, and do we have some sort of common understanding of what the risks of various kinds of transactions and investment flows are? and do we have the capacity to buffer them. Parallelly, I think while I would, I still like liberalization. I still think that the basic direction of the process has to be towards private agents both understanding the risks and essentially being incentivized to pay the price for protecting themselves against it. Eventually everything may fall back into the fiscal domain, but there's a huge moral hazard here if ultimately the government is either explicitly or implicitly signaling that, well, whatever risks there are in the system, I will take them on. So creating mechanisms, creating capacity, and creating knowledge about private solutions to managing risks, I think is very important. So I would treat the concept of recalibration, or the term recalibration, as also reflecting a parallel movement to creating the capacity for the private sector to manage risks. Because otherwise you have progress in terms of the flows and the returns, but the risks are borne by the public sector or by the system as a whole. So these two have to go hand in hand. So essentially it's, I think the governor used this analogy of walking alone versus walking together. And here I think you can translate that into recognizing that the returns are fine, but also they have to be adjusted by the need to hedge, the need to buffer yourself against risk. Those two have to go hand in hand.
Very good. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes and we have a number of prominent participants here with us. Dr. Kawai just published a book on managing capital flows. I've been reading your book in preparation for this conference. Perhaps you may want to share your views with us about this managing capital flows. Would you please, Dr. Kawai, from ADBI? Or you may want to ask questions, but I'm sure you could make contribution. Please.
Hello. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Responding to what you have heard from the three of the gentlemen.
I agree with most of the discussions, in particular with regard to capital flow management. Just one very minor comment and one big question. One minor comment is this distinction between macroprudential policy and capital flow management, which Mr. Menon talked about. The distinction may not be that clear as far as my point of view is concerned. The objective is essentially to ensure that the financial system in the country would be stable and resilient. Of course, macroprudential tools, for domestic markets, but restricting capital flows could be part of macroprudential policy. My big question is to Andrew, who gave us a very, very big and good perspective. I agree that even if individual countries are healthy, the whole system may not be healthy because of the interconnectedness. And even if individual financial institutions are healthy, the whole financial system may not be healthy because of the potential interconnectedness. I fully agree. However, in the system, there may be weak countries or weak financial institutions which may be affected more by some sort of shocks, and that can create a whole chain of events among countries and financial institutions, and weak ones tend to be affected significantly, and then further aggravating the chain of events and contagion. So the first policy objective would be to make sure that an individual country and an individual financial institution would be absolutely healthy. I think that's still a very, very important policy objective. The second point, which is a very difficult point, is that when the chain events take place, you want to cut at some point, like introducing a circuit breaker. Or introducing a floodgate to stop the contagion of events, stop the chain reactions. So that may mean that the government may have to intervene, or in the case of a financial crisis, to protect a financial institution from collapsing. Because a collapse of that financial institution may, create a chain events subsequently. So at some point, this intervention may be needed, but that may go against the principle of not saving, too big to fail, or too interconnected to fail. But here, I think some decisive action may be needed when a financial institution has a difficulty, or when a country has a difficulty, in the case of a currency crisis or financial crisis, or in the event of financial system crisis, some financial institutions may have to be protected, despite the fact that the financial institution may appear insolvent. Some, decisive action may be needed. So I want to hear if you agree or other panelists agree on this point. And then when a real crisis deepens, then a lot of liquidity would have to be provided, as we are seeing now, but that's after the second phase.
I would ask panelists to respond later. I have another discussion that I see. Manu, would you like to react to some of the things that you have heard, and then ask each of them to respond to both of you before I close? Please, Manu.
Thank you, thank you. I'd like to follow up on...
Can you hear in the back? Can you hear what Manu's speaking? Okay.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on the comments made by asking a question pertaining to monetary policy regimes. It strikes me that given the discussion, monetary policy regimes as exist today are under increasing challenge. The prescription in the past has been to liberalize capital account, have a monetary anchor such as inflation targeting or some kind of exchange rate based regime like Singapore has, and then that should work in managing the capital flows and so on. But what we're finding today is that this doesn't quite work. Take for instance, in Singapore's case, we had a monetary policy regime that was extraordinarily successful in keeping inflation low, in managing capital flows and so on. But in the last few years, we've seen Singapore's inflation rate higher than trading partners' inflation rate. First time this has happened in a long time. And we found that the macroprudential measures used to try and make the whole system work addressed at the property sector. For instance, there were restrictions on residential property. What has happened is that the liquidity has now moved into the industrial sector and caused a bit of a bubble in that sector. So my question really is that given this whole discussion, and especially what Andrew has said about how it is really a system-wide problem, is it time for countries to consider a fundamental change in their monetary policy regime? For instance, in Singapore's case, can we continue to have a long period of extremely low or even negative real interest rates that creates incentive for all kinds of speculative behaviors that can be distorting? Is it time to move away to an interest rate-based regime, for instance, but that would include having capital controls to make the whole system work? Thank you.
Very good. I'd like to ask each of you to respond, starting from Andrew. And this will be your closing statement as well, since the time is approaching. Please, Andrew.
Yeah, Hero, Professor Kawai always asks the right questions, but let me answer Manu first.
Yes.
Number one, we are treating monetary policy as if it was independent of fiscal policy, as if it was independent of regulatory policy, as if it was independent of real sector policies. They're all one continuum. Monetary policy cannot work independent of fiscal policy. If the fiscal side is out of whack, monetary policy cannot solve all the problems. Okay? And as we now know from the European crisis, the very, very important lesson, which reinforces that of the Asian crisis, if the banking system or the quasi-banking system is out of whack, monetary policy also has problems, right? And then ultimately it's a fiscal issue. So ultimately it boils down to a fiscal problem, which is exactly the spillover effect, which now answers Kawai-san's question. We have looked at this problem in silos, and Mervyn King made the best statement of all, which is that banking is global in life and national in depth. And individual banks have moved liabilities below the line, and if the regulators push them, move it offshore. And so all what we've done is to push this offshore liability, this balance sheet, private gain, into offshore so that I take immediate gain for my incentive, my bonuses. Unfortunately, when the whole thing collapses, this whole liability moves to a national fiscal balance sheet, which is unsustainable.
Socializing loss.
So it's like a recycling system where the toxic waste goes into the system, and as long as we try to solve the individual problem, we'll never solve this. That's the fundamental point I'm trying to make. That we're dealing with now global externalities or spillovers that is systemically non-sustainable, because ultimately national fiscal space is unsustainable, especially for the large ones. Now, why do we need to monitor the small guys? The small guys need to be monitored because you don't want incentives and spillovers, but they are by scale not systemic. The reason why we are in a systemic problem is that because the financial institutions and the economies that are associated with them are systemic. And for small economies, Hong Kong, Singapore, understood this very well. Strong fiscal discipline as the anchor of monetary stability. But you are not independent of the whole world. And if the global advanced market reserve currency Triffin dilemmas have a problem, we will be affected by this, however strong we are as parts of the system. Okay? And so to a large extent, we do need, and this is not a blame, I want to stress this is not a blame of individual banks, individual countries, individual sectors, or individuals. This is a systemic problem which stems ultimately from a paradigm that we have diagnosed in parts. And that paradigm capture is the heart of the problem that we have. And we're trying to explain in all the words that we use, but it's difficult to understand this until we accept the fact that we are in a system problem. And once we accept that, then we begin to have a solution. I personally don't have a solution, but my advocacy is that if there is a global financial transactions tax that taxes these highly leveraged transactions, so that you replace this. And I'm not advocating this for individual countries. I'm advocating global uniform financial transactions tax to solve the global fiscal space issue. And if that can be solved, I think we're heading towards a stable way of dealing with this unsustainable fiscal space question.
Well, sounds like what I heard from my auditor, about my accounts, moving this to that, moving that to this, and so on. Ravi, please, would you like to respond? And your final words also, please.
Yes, thanks. I'll make 4 points. The first two is in response to Kawai-san and to Manu's questions. I think Kawai-san asked a question about the distinction between macroprudential and capital flow management measures. Valid question. I think these are questions of semantics and how we organize our frameworks. There are those who would probably conflate the two together, and I would not say that that's wrong in their circumstances. But I think for countries like Hong Kong and Singapore, it is a very important distinction. Both countries have freely acknowledged that they've engaged in macroprudential policy measures to deal with some of these issues. But I think capital flow measures are really out of question. As small international financial centers, that would spell the death knell of their status in finance. So I think for us it's very important. And the distinction is really this. Macroprudential measures seek to address the effects of massive capital flows into and out of the economy. The capital flow management measures seek to address directly the flows. In other words, the capital flow management measures are addressed at the gate. At the point capital enters the system, you moderate, you turn it back, you tax it, and so on. So measures like Tobin tax, for instance. Capital flow management measures are different. It is saying that I will continue to maintain an open capital market regime and allow the flows into and out of the system. But I will address specific segments of the financial system and the economy where they are creating problems. And so when Hong Kong or Singapore change their loan-to-value ratios in banking, it is in a specific response to the effects of capital flows on property market overheating and the role of foreign funds. And in Singapore's case, we've also implemented a stamp duty, a fiscal measure on property transactions. Others have tried capital gains taxes. But these I would broadly classify as macroprudential. Capital flow management measures are those you apply at the gate, where you impose a tax directly on all flows into the country, or you place quantitative restrictions on flows or type of flows. Those are different. So that's the only distinction that I would draw. But like I said, I think these are questions of how we organize our thinking and our frameworks. And for some countries, it makes a lot of sense to have this distinction. Second, Manu's question on monetary policies. Yes, I think monetary policy has been complicated by some of these new developments in international financial markets, particularly large and volatile capital flows. But as Andrew said, I think we need to be careful about quickly substituting one set of tools to address a different problem. We have over a very long period of time, established quite clearly the workings of monetary policies, its transmission mechanisms, and what it is supposed to be targeted at, and which is really consumer price inflation. Now, if we start changing gears because we have a new problem of capital flows and asset market bubbles and pressures, and start shifting monetary policy to address it, then we I think, miss our core objective. The mistake that I think many central banks did was to completely ignore these pressures and to insist that as long as I can contain consumer price inflation, these other issues are not for me. I think that was a mistake. That was a mistake. But we must avoid the other extreme, which is now that I have 2 or 3 problems, I'm going to use the same tool to address 2 or 3 problems. You will completely lose credibility. What we need are new tools that work alongside traditional monetary policy to address a larger set of problems that cannot be addressed by monetary policy alone. So I would be quite cautious to start jettisoning some of our monetary policy thinking and approaches. Of course, we need to continue to review them and for the effectiveness. But it's not clear to me why, if, for instance, an exchange rate-centered policy helped to anchor expectations in the domestic economy, why switching to an interest rate regime would change that. Raising interest rates is probably going to lead to even more capital inflows into the country. So it's not necessarily an effective response. So I think we need to be cautious on that front. I want to make 2 other points by way of closing. The question of liberalization, I think I don't have a particular problem with the phrase. I think it remains valid. But I think the bigger gist of that is that there needs to be a paradigm change from the old notion that liberalization and deregulation is going to solve our problems. I think we have a richer understanding of it. I still believe that globalization and liberalization have been on balance, been beneficial. If you look at the post-war history as a total, in terms of prosperity, in terms of economic growth, and spreading the benefits of growth. But the world has entered a very distinctly different phase from the immediate post-war period. Considerably more risks associated with financial flows and leverage. And so you need, I think, in addition to liberalization, two other very key points. One is prudence, the other is resilience.
Okay.
You cannot assume that all countries can embark on the kind of liberalization that was envisaged about 30 years ago without building up domestic capacity and capabilities and resilience. Okay. So I think the prescription is not so much to insulate ourselves from the world, but to build up resilience to deal with a much more volatile and complex world. And before that, prudence. I think this goes to the question of leverage, which Andrew spoke about. The root cause. Now, we could argue whether the root cause was the rapid expansion in finance or financial intermediation, or the buildup of imbalances due to leverage. In a sense, they're interconnected. And where we want to strike the first blow, I think will vary according to our perspectives.
Okay.
But the fundamental problem is that large amounts of borrowing and leverage was made possible by an ever-expanding financial sector. Now, the causation is two-way. As the needs for borrowing increased, financial institutions and financial markets and financial products became much more sophisticated to accommodate those increased borrowing needs. And I think you need to address leverage at its core in both the public sector and the private sector.
Okay.
In the public sector, it must mean, and I think we're seeing the beginnings of that in the Eurozone, and that debate is still going on in America, which is fundamentally you've got to move towards much budget outcomes that are much closer to balance than they are today. If you're talking about imbalances and the fact that finance makes these imbalances possible, you've got to start addressing the imbalances. I think the way of the future, from an optimistic perspective, is that you will have much more balanced budget amendments, tighter fiscal rules in many parts of the world. And I think on balance that'll be good, because it will cut the source of leverage from the public sector.
Okay,
you still have private sector leverage, which is largely, in many countries I would say, driven by asset market pressures and the accumulation of large borrowings to finance assets whose values you think will go up indefinitely. I think that also needs a systemic solution. So if you have a systemic solution to leverage itself, I would personally not jump very quickly to measures directly targeted at reducing financial transactions.
Okay.
But that debate is something that's necessary and we need to have. Finally, I think, to use an analogy that we discussed just a month ago at the BIS annual conference, Jacob Frankel and I had a kind of interesting exchange on this. It's about the future of financial globalization, how open we want to be. And the analogy is like driving a car. I think the question is not whether we should drive or whether we should not drive. I think there are tremendous benefits in being able to drive a car. And likewise, there are tremendous benefits in being plugged into the global economy and the global financial system. To step back would be at our own peril. But there are very important considerations. First, to drive a car, you need a license. Likewise, if we are globalizing financially, we need to build up those capacities and capabilities I mentioned. You need to be able to handle. Second, the roads on which we are traveling have become a lot more tricky. I think you need to adjust your speeds according to changing terrain, according to changing weather conditions. And like Andrew said, the road network itself in some ways has become unsustainable. We cannot ignore what other drivers are doing. We cannot ignore what the traffic complications are. And caution is required as we drive. And in extreme cases, when the engine overheats, when things get really bad, you better pull over and stop.
Okay.
And those are the capital flow management measures that we might need to do once in a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Maybe Subi, please. Sorry, the time is running out.
No problem. I just want to address the question Manu raised about monetary policy paradigms. I think I generally agree with Ravi's characterization, which is that we should not lose sight of the fact that the core objective of monetary policy is inflation management. Now, whether that's the only objective or it is part of our set of objectives is, of course, an open debate. But that it is the primary objective, I think, is really not subject to the same debate. So, regardless of what else happens and what other forces are at work on the overall macroeconomic environment, that I think we should not lose sight of, that monetary policy is essentially mapped onto inflation control. Now, of course, there are these other forces, and we've already talked about them, and I would basically see them in two buckets. There is the external sector force, which is capital inflows and exchange rate dynamics and so on. And there is a financial sector force, which is risks building up in the financial system, liquidity pressures. And I think the approach that one needs to visualize is if these are in some way impeding the transmission of monetary impulses and sort of weakening the link between monetary action and inflation, then we have to find measures to offset these forces. And I think that's the broader framework within which we might look at monetary policy as a monetary policy as an emphasis or primacy on inflation, but with the use of other instruments, as Ravi said, to offset the diluting impact of other forces. But on the broader issue, just as a very quick concluding comment, I think I will re-emphasize the need to flesh out this middle ground. We have a clear theory of floating rates and its implications. We have, I would say, if a reasonable theory of fixed rates and its macroeconomic implications. But where we are all now in is the middle, and we don't have an adequate sort of analytical foundation for that. We are working towards it. I think we've started thinking about it in more analytical terms and less sort of prejudicial terms. And that's the very important development, because it's going to vary by country, it's going to vary by the nature of the shock, it's going to vary by the strength of domestic institutions, the history, the legacy of domestic institutions. And I think putting these into some simple characterizations is going to be very important. We, I think, are broadly agreed that some form of capital management, in whatever category you put them, is perhaps now a necessary part of the toolkit. I don't think we have any debate on that. But we also have to recognize that there are perhaps better measures and worse measures for any country in any given situation. And that distinction, I think, is yet to be firmly grounded in an analytical framework. And that's really, I think, where we need to go.
Good, thank you. I have to bring the session to a close. We have had a very interesting session. We've heard that we've got lots of money in the world, but because of all this money flowing in and out all over the place, but with the interconnection among the financial institutions and financial agents, making these capital flows a very difficult matters to manage. But more money is better than no money, so we need to be able to manage it. And the idea about liberalization should be pursued. But basically, in order to make the private sector to be more capable of managing risk, that by way of widening and deepening the financial sector, that should be done. Plus the public policies on macroeconomic management to balance the saving and investment, and finally including prudential measures that need to be applied in order to manage this new type or new feature of capital flows that we are seeing in the world. Well, with that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the second panel. It has indeed been an insightful and highly stimulating session. May I now ask our distinguished members of this second panel kindly to pose for a group photo-taking session together before leaving the stage. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the morning segment of our program today. I'm happy to inform you that our international buffet lunch is now ready to be served in the dining hall immediately adjacent to this conference hall. The venue is just to your right-hand side, immediately as you exit the conference hall. We will therefore, this is a 90-minute lunch break, and we will be coming back here at 2:30 p.m. to start the afternoon session. Thank you. Bon appétit and enjoy your lunch.